The sun was barely rising over Los Angeles, its golden rays struggling to pierce through the haze of smog that blanketed the city. In a dimly lit motel room on the outskirts of downtown, Calvin Broadus, better known to the world as Snoop Dogg, sat hunched over a cracked bathroom sink. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap cleaning products, but Snoop barely noticed. He was focused, his eyes locked on the reflection staring back at him. The transformation had taken weeks of preparation. A team of professional makeup artists had worked tirelessly to perfect the disguise. The man in the mirror bore no resemblance to the suave rapper known for his effortless charm and smooth flow. Instead, he looked worn down by life, a scruffy beard streaked with gray, deep lines etched into his face, and a layer of grime that seemed permanent. His clothes were mismatched and threadbare, reeking of desperation and neglect. "Damn," he muttered under his breath, tilting his head to examine the effect. "Even I wouldn't give me $1. Snoop's mission was clear. He wanted to experience firsthand how society, and more importantly, law enforcement, treated those they deemed invisible. The idea had come to him after reading about countless incidents of police brutality and systemic bias, stories that made his blood boil. He'd spent years using his platform to speak out against injustice, but this time, he wanted to do more. He wanted to expose the truth in a way no one could ignore. The plan was risky, and his team had voiced their concerns. "What if something goes wrong?" his manager had asked during a heated meeting. "What if the cops don't recognize you? What if they—" He hadn't finished the sentence, but the implication was clear. In America, even a man as famous as Snoop Dogg wasn't immune to the dangers of systemic racism. Snoop had waved off their fears with his signature grin. "That's the whole point, ain't it? If they treat me like this, imagine what they do to folks who ain't got no voice." Now, as he stepped out into the cool morning air, the weight of his decision hit him. He pulled the hood of his ragged sweatshirt over his head and shuffled down the street, blending seamlessly into the city's unseen population. The streets were already bustling with activity, early risers rushing to work, food vendors setting up their stalls, and the ever-present hum of traffic filling the air. Snoop's first stop was a coffee shop on the corner of Main and Fifth. He lingered outside, watching as well-dressed patrons streamed in and out, clutching their steaming cups of caffeine. Gathering his courage, he approached a middle-aged woman in a business suit. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and tentative. "Could you spare some change? Just trying to get a coffee." The woman didn't even look at him. She clutched her designer bag tighter and stepped around him, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Snoop sighed and tried again, this time approaching a young man in a hoodie. The response was the same, a curt shake of the head and averted eyes. By the time he finally managed to collect enough coins for a small coffee, nearly an hour had passed. Inside the shop, he felt the weight of every gaze on him. The barista's smile faltered when he approached the counter, her eyes darting nervously to her coworkers. Other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, casting furtive glances in his direction. Snoop pretended not to notice, but the tension was palpable. As he left the shop, a group of teenagers passed him on the sidewalk. One of them wrinkled his nose and muttered, "Smells like trash," loud enough for Snoop to hear. He kept walking, his jaw tightening with anger. It wasn't the first insult he'd heard that morning, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. By midday, Snoop found himself in a bustling urban square, the heat of the sun beating down on his back. The square was a microcosm of the city itself. Street performers entertaining small crowds, food trucks serving everything from tacos to kebabs, and a mix of people, some wealthy, some struggling, navigating their day. Snoop chose a spot near a fountain and sat down, his shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat. He watched as two men, both clearly homeless, began arguing nearby. Their voices grew louder, drawing the attention of passers-by. Snoop considered stepping in but decided against it. He didn't want to break character, and besides, he wasn't sure it would help. Moments later, a police car pulled up. Two officers stepped out, their hands resting on their holsters. The atmosphere shifted instantly, the lively chatter of the square replaced by a tense silence. Snoop's heart raced as the officers approached the men. "What's going on here?" one of them barked, his tone sharp and accusatory. The men tried to explain, their words tumbling over each other in a jumble of frustration and fear. The officers didn't seem to care. One of them grabbed the nearest man by the arm, pulling him roughly to his feet. "Hey! Hold up," Snoop said, unable to stay silent any longer. He stood up, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "They ain't doing nothing wrong. Just having a disagreement, that's all." The officer turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "And who the hell are you?" he demanded. Snoop hesitated, the weight of his disguise suddenly feeling suffocating. Just someone trying to help," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer sneered. "Help, huh? Maybe you should help yourself first. Get a job, clean yourself up. You people are all the same." The words hit Snoop like a punch to the gut. He felt his fists clench at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. The hidden camera tucked into his jacket was recording every word. And he knew he couldn't blow his cover now. The officers eventually left, taking one of the men with them. The other man sat down on the ground, his head in his hands. Snoop wanted to comfort him, to tell him that things would get better, but the words felt hollow. Instead, he sat beside the man in silence, the weight of the morning's events pressing heavily on his shoulders. As the sun began to set, Snoop made his way back to the motel. His body ached from hours of walking, and his spirit felt even more battered. He'd expected the day to be difficult. But the reality had been far worse. The casual cruelty, the indifference, the outright hostility, it was more than he'd anticipated. Snoop collapsed onto the lumpy motel bed, staring up at the stained ceiling. He thought about the officers, the people who'd ignored him, the insults he'd endured. And then he thought about the millions of others who lived this reality every single day, with no end in sight. "Tomorrow," he muttered to himself, his voice filled with determination. "Tomorrow. We start exposing this shit." Outside, the city buzzed on, oblivious to the man behind the disguise and the storm he was about to unleash. The morning air was crisp and heavy with the smell of asphalt and exhaust as Snoop shuffled back to the square from the day before. Today, he had a different plan. He wanted to provoke the system not by causing trouble, but by existing where the system didn't want him to be. He chose his spot carefully. A bench in front of a high-end retail store where the well-to-do of Los Angeles came to spend their afternoons browsing designer labels. Settling into his seat, Snoop pulled out a battered cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps. God bless." He held it loosely in his hands, letting it rest on his lap as he watched the streams of people go by. For the first half hour, the reactions were predictable: averted eyes, quickened steps, murmurs exchanged between strangers about the state of the city and people who refused to help themselves. Then, a police cruiser rolled up. Two officers stepped out, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other smaller but exuding the same aura of authority. Their faces were blank, but their body language screamed annoyance. They'd been called here by someone, Snoop realized. Likely one of the store managers or a concerned shopper. His stomach tightened as they approached, their boots clicking against the pavement like a countdown. "Sir," the taller officer began, his voice clipped, "we've received complaints about loitering. You're going to need to move along." Snoop raised his head slowly, meeting the officer's gaze. He kept his voice calm, even. "I'm just sitting here, man. Ain't hurting nobody." The smaller officer crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "This is private property. If you don't leave, we'll have to escort you off the premises." "Private property?" Snoop gestured at the bench beneath him. "Pretty sure this here's a public sidewalk." The tall officer's jaw tightened. "We're not going to argue about this. Pack up your things and go, or you'll be cited for trespassing." A small crowd had started to gather, drawn by the escalating tension. Snoop could feel their eyes on him, a mix of curiosity and judgment. He glanced around, spotting a few phones pointed in his direction. Good, he thought. The more eyes on this, the better. "I got nowhere else to go," he said, keeping his voice steady. "And even if I did, Why should I have to leave? I'm just trying to sit here, same as anyone else. The smaller officer stepped forward, his hand resting on the baton at his belt. You've been warned. Last chance. Snoop's pulse quickened, but he held his ground. You're always like this. Harrison folks just cause they look different. That was all it took. The smaller officer grabbed Snoop by the arm, pulling him to his feet. The movement was rough, deliberate. Snoop stumbled but didn't resist, the hidden camera on his chest capturing every moment. The taller officer reached for his radio, calling for backup as the crowd murmured in protest. Hey, take it easy, someone shouted. A young woman with a baby stroller stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. He's not doing anything wrong. Step back, the tall officer warned, his tone firm but dismissive. More voices joined in, a chorus of indignation growing louder by the second. Snoop could see the tension building in the officers' faces, their composure slipping. They weren't used to this kind of pushback, not from bystanders. The smaller officer's grip tightened on Snoop's arm as if to reassert control. Let him go, an older man said, his voice carrying over the crowd. You're making a scene for no reason. The officers hesitated, their eyes darting between Snoop and the growing throng of onlookers. Finally, the taller one spoke. All right, that's enough. We're letting him go, but this is your warning. Don't come back here. The smaller officer released Snoop with a shove, sending him stumbling back onto the bench. The crowd erupted in jeers, their collective frustration bubbling over. The officers retreated to their cruiser, their faces grim, and drove off without another word. For a moment, the square was silent except for the hum of the engine fading into the distance. Then, a young man stepped forward, his phone still recording. Hey, you okay? He asked, his voice tinged with concern. Snoop nodded, his heart still racing. Yeah, I'm good. Thanks for having my back. The young man frowned. This happens all the time around here. They think just 'cause someone's down on their luck, they don't deserve to be treated like a person. Snoop looked around at the faces surrounding him, a mix of anger and solidarity. He felt a surge of hope, a reminder that not everyone was content to look the other way. We gotta start changin' that, he said, more to himself than anyone else. As the crowd dispersed, Snoop stayed seated, his mind racing. The footage he'd captured today was powerful. But it wasn't enough. He needed more encounters, more evidence, more undeniable proof of the bias that poisoned the system. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, sending a quick text to his team. Got good footage today. Need to plan next steps. The reply came almost instantly. Be careful out there. We've got your back. Snoop leaned back on the bench, the cardboard sign still resting on his lap. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the square. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow, we keep pushin'. The footage from the previous day played on a large screen in the dimly lit room. Snoop sat at the head of the table, surrounded by his team of confidants, activists, and legal advisors. The tension was palpable as the video looped through the heated encounter with the police officers and the reactions of the crowd. Every moment was raw, unfiltered, and damning. This is it, said Jamal, his media strategist. This is the kind of proof people can't look away from. Snoop leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in thought. Yeah, but it ain't enough. We gotta hit 'em harder. Make it undeniable. They gotta see the whole picture, not just the cops, but the people who called 'em in the first place. Lisa, a seasoned civil rights lawyer, nodded in agreement. We've got the legal groundwork to support this. Public spaces are for everyone, and targeting someone based on appearance is clear-cut discrimination. But you're right, Snoop. We need more. A broader pattern of behavior to expose the systemic nature of this bias. So what's next? Asked Jamal. Snoop stood, his tall frame commanding attention. Next, we take it up a notch. More locations, more scenarios. We hit the high-end neighborhoods, the busy transit hubs, anywhere we can show the world what it's like to be invisible. And this time, we're goin' live. The room buzzed with energy as the team broke into smaller groups, each planning their next move. Snoop's vision was clear. Create a tapestry of encounters that couldn't be dismissed as isolated incidents. With his disguise perfected and his resolve unshaken, he was ready to dive deeper into the harsh reality he'd only scratched the surface of. The next day, Snoop found himself in the heart of a wealthy suburb, standing in front of a pristine, manicured park. It was the kind of place where joggers in designer gear and families with expensive strollers spent their afternoons. He sat on a bench near the entrance, his cardboard sign once again propped up against his knees. Within minutes, he felt the weight of judgmental gazes. A woman jogging past gave him a wide berth, her nose wrinkling in disdain. A man walking his dog paused several feet away, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to discomfort. Snoop's hidden camera recorded it all. But the moment of truth came when a park security guard approached. He was young, barely out of his 20s, but the authority in his posture was unmistakable. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the guard said, his tone polite but firm. Snoop tilted his head, feigning confusion. "Why? I ain't doing nothing but sitting here." The guard's smile tightened. "We've had complaints. People are uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable?" Snoop gestured around him. "I'm just trying to rest my feet. Ain't no law against sitting on a bench." The guard hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at a pair of women watching from a distance. Their arms were crossed, their expressions a mix of fear and disdain. "Look, man," the guard said, lowering his voice. "I get it. Times are tough. But this ain't the place for this. You know?" Snoop felt a surge of anger but kept his voice even. "Nah, I don't know. Maybe you can explain it to me. What's this you talking about?" The guard's face flushed. Before he could finish, a voice rang out. "Hey, leave him alone." The crowd's attention snapped to a middle-aged man in a faded work uniform. He stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "He's got just as much right to be here as anyone else." The guard's composure faltered. "Sir, I'm just doing my job." "Your job," the man shot back, "is to keep this park safe, not to harass people who ain't done nothing wrong." More voices joined in. A small but growing chorus of support. Snoop watched as the tide shifted, the onlookers turning their scrutiny from him to the guard. The power dynamic had flipped, and for the first time that day, Snoop felt a glimmer of hope. "Fine," the guard said, throwing up his hands. "But if there's any trouble, it's on you." He walked away, his shoulders stiff with frustration. As the crowd dispersed, the man in the work uniform approached Snoop. "You good, brother?" he asked. Snoop nodded, his gratitude genuine. "Yeah, man. Appreciate you steppin' up like that." The man shrugged. "Ain't right what they do to people like us. Someone's gotta say something. Snoop watched him walk away, a mix of admiration and sadness swirling in his chest. He'd seen the best and worst of humanity in the span of a single hour, and it only strengthened his resolve. That evening, Snoop went live on social media, broadcasting the day's events to millions of followers. The comments poured in, a torrent of outrage and support. #WeSeeYou began trending within minutes. A rallying cry for those who'd felt invisible for too long. "This ain't just about me," Snoop said, his voice steady and impassioned. "It's about every person out there who's been treated like they don't matter. Like they ain't human. We gotta do better. And it starts with us calling it out when we see it." The live stream ended. But the momentum didn't stop. By the next morning, news outlets were running stories on Snoop's experiment, the footage sparking heated debates on talk shows and social media alike. Activists rallied behind him, organizing marches and forums to address systemic bias and inequality. Snoop watched it all unfold from his modest hotel room. The weight of his mission pressing heavily on him. He'd set out to make a difference, and now the world was watching. But the fight was far from over. Tomorrow, he thought, as he prepared for another day undercover. Tomorrow, we go even deeper. The world woke up to a storm. Overnight, Snoop's livestream had reached millions, sparking outrage, debate, and a collective call for change. News anchors dissected every second of the footage, activists rallied behind the cause. And law enforcement agencies across the country found themselves thrust into an unwanted spotlight. Snoop had shattered the facade, exposing the deeply ingrained biases that many had long denied. But with the wave of support came a torrent of backlash. Social media lit up with polarized opinions. Some hailed Snoop as a hero, while others accused him of stirring up unnecessary drama or misrepresenting the real situation. Hashtags like #JusticeForAll and #DivideAndSnoop trended side by side, embodying the nation's division. Snoop sat in the makeshift war room his team had set up in a downtown Los Angeles office. Screens lined the walls, displaying news segments, social media feeds, and video clips from his undercover missions. The room buzzed with activity as his team coordinated their next steps. Lisa, his lawyer, stood at the head of the table. "We've got 3 options moving forward," she began. 1. We let the footage speak for itself and rely on public outrage to drive change. 2. We file a class action lawsuit against the police departments involved, citing systemic discrimination. Or 3. We push for legislative reform and use this momentum to lobby for new laws. Snoop leaned forward, his expression serious. "Why not all 3? We've got the attention. Let's use it." The room fell silent for a moment as his words sank in. Then Jamal, his media strategist, broke into a grin. "Man, you're thinking big. I like it." Lisa nodded. "It'll be a fight, but we're ready." The fight began that afternoon with a press conference streamed live to millions. Snoop stood at the podium, dressed simply in a hoodie and jeans, his disguise now a symbol of the injustice he was fighting against. Behind him stood a coalition of activists, community leaders, and even a few celebrities who'd joined the cause. "This ain't about me," Snoop said, his voice steady and powerful. "This is about every person who's been judged, mistreated, or overlooked just because of how they look. We all deserve respect. We all deserve dignity. And we're not gonna stop until we get it." He laid out his plan. A nationwide campaign to address systemic bias, starting with a petition demanding mandatory anti-discrimination training for law enforcement officers. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. As the days turned into weeks, the campaign gained momentum. Cities across the country saw protests and marches, each one larger than the last. The footage of Snoop's encounters became a rallying cry, played on screens at rallies and shared endlessly online. The phrase "we see you" became a movement, emblazoned on signs, t-shirts, and social media profiles. Lawmakers began to take notice. Meetings were scheduled, hearings were held, and the pressure mounted for real change. Snoop testified before Congress, his calm demeanor and powerful words captivating the nation. "You can't fix what you won't face," he told the room of lawmakers. "And right now, we're facing it. The question is, what are y'all gonna do about it?" Back in Los Angeles, the impact of Snoop's efforts was already visible. Community programs sprang up, funded in part by donations to the We See You movement. Police departments began implementing new training protocols, and several high-ranking officials resigned in the wake of public scrutiny. But it wasn't just institutions that changed. People did, too. Conversations about bias and privilege became commonplace, challenging individuals to confront their own prejudices. For every detractor who clung to the status quo, there were countless others who embraced the opportunity to grow. 1 year later, the movement reached a milestone. The We See You Act, a comprehensive bill aimed at combating systemic discrimination, passed with bipartisan support. The law mandated anti-bias training, established oversight committees, and allocated funds for community policing initiatives. Snoop stood on the steps of the Capitol, the crowd below him stretching as far as the eye could see. He held the signed bill aloft, the cheers of the crowd washing over him. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting the weight of the moment sink in. He'd set out to expose the truth, and now, that truth was transforming the nation. Later that night, Snoop sat on the balcony of his home, looking out over the city. The lights of Los Angeles twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the millions of lives he'd touched. He'd done what he'd set out to do, he'd made the invisible visible. And while the fight was far from over, he knew the world would never be the same. With a deep breath, he raised a glass of his favorite gin and juice to the stars. To progress, he said softly, a small smile playing on his lips. And to never giving up. Years had passed since Snoop Dogg's experiment shook the nation. The We See You movement had transformed from a rallying cry into a cornerstone of cultural and institutional change. Across the country, cities were implementing policies rooted in equity and inclusion. But the story of the movement wasn't just one of systemic reform, it was one of individual lives touched and futures rewritten. The day began like any other in south-central Los Angeles. But for a young man named Malik, it was a day that symbolized opportunity. He stood in front of the local community center, clutching a folder containing his application for a police academy scholarship funded by the We See You initiative. Malik had grown up in the same streets that had once been patrolled with suspicion and hostility, but now, the officers were familiar faces, deeply connected to the community they served. "You got this, man," said his mentor, an officer named Maria Torres, who had joined the force after being inspired by Snoop's campaign. Maria had been one of the first recruits under the new program that prioritized diversity, empathy, and accountability in law enforcement. Her presence was a testament to the change that had taken root. "Thanks, Torres," Malik said, his voice steady with determination. "I'm gonna make you proud." Elsewhere, in a boardroom overlooking downtown Chicago, business leaders gathered for the annual We See You Summit. The event had become a major fixture in corporate America, attracting CEOs, policymakers, and activists to discuss progress and challenges in the fight against systemic bias. Lisa, now a nationally renowned civil rights attorney, stood at the podium, her presence commanding. Behind her, a banner read, "Beyond Awareness, Building a Just Tomorrow." "When we started this journey," Lisa began, "we faced resistance from those who said change was impossible. But here we are, proving them wrong every single day. Equity is not just a buzzword, it's a responsibility." The audience erupted into applause, the energy in the room electric. Among them sat Jamal, who had pivoted from media strategist to founder of a non-profit that trained grassroots organizers. He smiled, knowing they were witnessing history in the making. Snoop, now semi-retired from the music industry, spent most of his days mentoring young artists and activists. His foundation, aptly named the Dog Pound for Justice, funded initiatives ranging from education to prison reform. Today, he was scheduled to visit a high school in Oakland, where students had been studying the impact of the We See You movement as part of their curriculum. As Snoop walked into the auditorium, the students erupted into cheers. He raised his hand, signaling for quiet, but his grin was impossible to hide. "You're wild," he said, his voice as smooth as ever. "But for real, I'm proud of y'all. You're the future. And the fact that you're learning about this, that's how we keep this thing going. One student raised her hand. "Mr. Broadus, did you ever think it would get this big?" Snoop chuckled. "Truth? Nah. Not like this. I just wanted to show folks what's real. But see, that's the thing about truth, once you put it out there, it's got a life of its own. And it's all of us who keep it alive." The evening brought a more solemn moment. Snoop attended the unveiling of a new monument in Washington, D.C. The We See You Memorial, a towering sculpture of intertwined hands, symbolized unity, resilience, and the power of visibility. Hundreds gathered at the site, including many who had been directly impacted by the movement. As the crowd fell silent, Snoop stepped up to the microphone. He paused, taking in the faces before him, some tearful, others beaming with pride. "This monument ain't just about what we did," he said. "It's about what we're still doing. It's about the work that never stops. We ain't perfect, but we're better than we were. And that's something to celebrate." He placed his hand on the base of the sculpture, where an inscription read, "To those who were unseen, to those who stood up, and to those who continue the fight, we see you." Later that night, back in his quiet home, Snoop reflected on the journey. The scars of the past hadn't faded, but they no longer defined the present. His actions had sparked a revolution, and though the work was far from over, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. As he gazed out at the night sky, a familiar phrase came to mind. Raising a glass, he spoke softly to himself. To progress. And to never giving up.